Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I would like to welcome you to today's Cornerstone webinar. My name is Christina Carter Grant, and I serve as Senior Program Officer on our National Leadership Team and Education Team here at the Center for Community Progress. Cornerstone is our webinar series, which equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Kim Graziani and Nika Namdi. Kim Graziani is the president and CEO of Indigo Collaborative LLC, a national consulting firm dedicated to building trust and sharing power between local government and residents to equitably revitalize community, and serves as the technical assistant senior advisor at the Center for Community Progress. Over the past 12 years, Kim helped build and lead Community Progress's National Technical Assistance Program, which has served over 300 communities in 35 states. She is considered one of the leading national experts in land banking and property tax reform. Her recent publication, most relevant to today's discussion, is Reimagine Delinquent Property Tax Enforcement: How to Reduce Vacancy, Advance Racial Equity, and Improve Public Services. Other publications, including those focused on land banking and community land trusts, can be found on Community Progress's website. Nika Namdi is a Baltimore-based entrepreneur engaged in social mission-driven business and community wellness work. She lives in Upton. It is one of Baltimore's most storied but blighted neighborhoods, and her lived experience there has given birth to Fight Blight Be More, a social and environmental justice tool for residents to identify, report, track, and remediate blight. Additionally, Nika is one of the co-creators of the SOS, or Stop Oppressive Seizures, fund that assists neighbors during the tax sale season and works diligently to dismantle the tax sale. Now, before we turn it over to Kim and Nika, I do want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please click the stage tab on the right side of your screen, select chat, and type your question into the chat box. We will share presentation slides as well as a copy of today's video recording in the week following. If you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Julia Zimmerman at jzimmerman@communityprogress.org. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Kim.
Great. Thank you, Christina. And good afternoon or good morning. I am joining you from Birmingham, Alabama. So we still have about an hour left of the morning. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today. And really, you all deserve quite a gold star for taking time out of your day to actually willingly listen, think, and talk about property taxes. So we really appreciate it. And I just am thrilled to be with you all today with someone I continue to be in awe of, which is Nika Namdi. Next slide, please. So our goal for today is, one, not to put you to sleep, and two, to share a little bit more about what is this thing we call delinquent property taxes, why we care about it, provide a guide of how you can analyze your own delinquent property tax systems in your own community, and noting some of the particular landmines along the way, like the sale of tax liens. And last but not least, to inspire each and every one of you that reform is possible and really hear about the great work that Nika and others in Baltimore are doing. Last but certainly not least, we'll open it up for questions. However, as Christina mentioned, please do not hesitate to ask questions as we go along. I know when I'm presenting, Nika is going to be taking a look at the questions and vice versa. So if you have a burning question, please feel free to put it into the chat. And then my last disclaimer before we jump into it is every state's tax laws are different. There's differences in the way delinquent property taxes are collected, options for what happens when a property owner becomes delinquent. And so while we are giving a broad overview of sort of setting the framework and groundwork of what this is, and Nika will be talking about Baltimore City, we encourage each and every one of you to talk to your local legal counsel, community folks, others who really understand the system in your own community. And opening up that dialogue actually does wonders. So thank you again. And next slide, please. So why do we care? Property taxes are not the most exciting dinner time topic, but they are incredibly important. So for those of you joining us today from local government to residents to folks in the private sector and everywhere in between, property taxes keep the lights on. They are by far the most crucial source of locally controlled tax revenue. They fill the potholes, they keep the schools opened, and they literally and figuratively put out the fires each and every day in our communities. But the way that they have been administered and collected have unfortunately exploited many communities of color for decades across the country. They can keep properties stuck with little hope of intervention. And unfortunately, they can fail to direct these properties into the hands of new, responsible, community-minded ownership. So we want to acknowledge that there's critical choices that a handful of actors play in what happens when property taxes are not paid, and particularly for those problem properties, vacant, abandoned properties that keep you all up at night. And county treasurers, city treasurers, revenue departments, there's justifiable pressure to collect the most revenue, yet there are unintended consequences that occur when local governments turn over their collection efforts to private out-of-town investors and lose all control of what happens to the property moving forward. Next slide, please. So, in order to really talk about property taxes and what happens when property taxes aren't paid, I think we really need to take a moment and acknowledge the unfortunate history of how property tax systems have been and still are unjust and exploitive, particularly to communities of color. In too many communities across the country, similar stories we hear all the time about ancestral land and homes that have been the beacons of pride and safety and love for so many generations taken away through the property tax enforcement system. Again, this continues to happen disproportionately to communities of color. Therefore, when we talk about property tax enforcement and begin to assess and strategize how to fix these broken and unjust systems, we need to understand and learn from past mistakes. There are many ways that property tax systems can be exploitive, from the way properties are assessed to the lack of outreach and availability of property relief programs, or what we sometimes call circuit breaker programs, that provide financial and other support early in the process. The ultimate goal is, how can we all work together to prevent properties from becoming delinquent? Because once properties actually enter into the delinquent collection status, it's much more difficult to intervene. So one of our goals today is to really talk about how to make these property tax enforcement systems more equitable. Next slide, please. So we also care about taxes because in our experience of working with hundreds of communities across the country, one of the leading causes of vacancy and abandonment is a broken, delinquent tax enforcement system. Tax delinquency is by far, in the vast majority of states, states that actually do have a significant tax that they enforce, is that it's the clearest warning sign that a property is at risk of entering a cycle of decline unless there is swift intervention. And I think we all know too well that time is the worst enemy of any vacant and abandoned property. Therefore, having an inefficient system that waits several years to collect delinquent taxes from owners who have long since walked away is not good. So one thing we want to address today is, how can we make our systems more efficient and expedite the process, again, for vacant properties, to avoid a property looking like this? Next slide, please. So we also care because we have found that the most effective intervention in any kind of vacant abandoned property that's tax delinquent is swiftly transferring it into responsible ownership. And the most common way to do this is through the foreclosure of delinquent taxes and municipal liens. So again, what we want to talk about is how can we create a system that is most effective in collecting the most amount of revenue, right? Tax payments prior to vacancy and abandonment. And if the property owners do walk away and property taxes are not paid, how can we make sure that a transfer of title is insurable and marketable and swiftly made to a new responsible owner? Next slide. So this is just to reiterate that property taxes have a huge impact on racial equity, from the prevention of displacement, vacancy, and disinvestment, to the acquisition of vacant properties to support more equitable development. And lastly, but not least, is to the investment in public services and community priorities. Making sure that there are open processes by which we can have a say in how our tax dollars are spent are critical. Next slide. So let's just make sure we all have a common foundation. So here are the basic elements of delinquent property tax enforcement. So basically, property taxes are not paid, penalties and interest accrue and ultimately become a lien on the property. Considering that property taxes are a first priority lien, meaning that they must be paid before other liens such as mortgages, they hold the ultimate control of whether local government is paid and whether local government can foreclose on those delinquent taxes and acquire the property. Notice is given to an owner. Interested parties are offered an opportunity to redeem the property, usually through full payment. And then there's an enforcement event, right? Either the property itself or the debt is transferred for collection or sold. Next slide. So there is a real danger of selling the debt and not the property itself. And again, one of the primary actors in any property tax enforcement system is the tax collector. This position varies greatly across jurisdictions in terms of being elected versus appointed and the geography for which taxes are collected. However, their job ultimately, and rightfully so, is to collect as much revenue as quickly as possible, plain and simple. However, we know that sometimes these short-term rational financial decisions sometimes have long-term negative implications. So what we've seen, unfortunately, over the past few decades, in light of local government staffing cuts and an increased need for revenue, that jurisdictions have decided to reduce their in-house property tax collection team and instead now transfer and sell the delinquent taxes and liens and control of collection and enforcement to private investors. While this process can result in a quick infusion of revenue to cash-strapped jurisdictions, it also has unintended consequences. So by transferring these liens and all accompanying enforcement mechanisms to a private investor, local governments lose the ability to force a transfer in ownership through tax foreclosure. So in areas where there's stressed market demand, this loss of government leverage can lead to private investors either choosing to hold the lien on the property, possibly speculate on future payments of interest and accrued penalties, rather than foreclosing and selling the property to a responsible party. And unfortunately, many times these properties become or remain vacant and impose significant costs on the surrounding community. Next slide. So these are just a few myths that we have heard about tax lien sales that we encourage you to ask further questions in your community. So one is, don't tax lien sales bring in more revenue? So we've done incredible work, Community Progress has, in places like Rochester and Baltimore. And in our research, we haven't conclusively found that the sale of tax liens indeed is the most effective mechanism to maximize public revenue. In fact, as I just mentioned, for those vacant and abandoned properties where the tax lien was sold, significant public costs were required to address the public safety and deterioration of those properties. Another common question or myth we hear is, don't private investors or buyers care about getting the property and not just the profit? So we have found again in our research that very few private investors or buyers who purchase a tax lien actually take title to the property. Just an example, we did a survey across counties in Maryland, and we actually found that less than 0.001% of those private buyers actually foreclosed on the owner's right of redemption and took title. Next slide. So let's go quickly with just a few questions that you all can pose to yourselves about how to evaluate your local delinquent property tax enforcement processes. Next slide. So probably the most important slide is your delinquent property tax enforcement process equitable? So is there a fair assessment system? Is there authentic outreach about the availability of property tax relief programs or circuit breaker programs? Does state or local law or local practice allow hardship plans? For those who have truly hit hard times, many communities offer a payment plan that works for the specific household, allowing them to pay a portion of their delinquent taxes and not lose their properties. Next slide. Is your delinquent property tax enforcement process effective? So are you collecting the maximum tax payments prior to vacancy and deterioration? And in the event of non-payment, this is the critical question, is a transfer of title insurable and marketable to a new responsible owner? A process that what we call judicial in rem, which is taking an enforcement action against the property and not the person, and actually a process that Baltimore is just starting in earnest with a pilot, basically is what we call the gold standard, judicial in rem tax foreclosure. It means that proper notice is given on the front end. A petition is made through a judge to ensure proper notice is given. And then it moves on to foreclosure, which usually results in clear and insurable title, which again is the ultimate goal. Next slide. And lastly, is it efficient? Is it clear that property taxes are the first priority lien? So if I am a delinquent taxpayer, am I forced to pay the full amount of cost to the local government? Am I, the taxpayer, clear on when that final decision on enforcement is made? And in terms of service and notice, for those properties that have long been vacant and abandoned, we see too many times multiple and duplicative notice provisions that go way beyond what is constitutionally required, and honestly do not result in payment or any other action by that matter. So are there measures in place to expedite the process for vacant abandoned properties? Next slide. So I'm going to end by saying that reform is possible. These systems are incredibly complicated. And there are so many times a community reaches out to us and says, there's no way we could fix our system. There's too much money at stake. There's too much politics at work. But inevitably, it has happened. There are resources that are available on our website. I encourage you all to take a look. And, broken systems these systems did not happen overnight. But I think if we can continue talking about them, unpacking them, making sure that they're not too technical and purposely confusing. And again, if we could have folks like Nika and support folks like Nika who are doing this yeoman's work in Baltimore, I think we can have a lot more successes across the country. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nika. And again, if there are any specific questions, burning questions, please let us know. And Nika, before I transfer it over to you, is there any questions that you think we should go over before we jump in? Oh, you're muted, Nika.
I muted so no background noise, but then I'm muting. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Nika Nambi. Yes, there is one question from JL Strand in rural Minnesota. He wants to know whether Center for Community Progress has done a survey to see where the 50 states are in terms of who does tax lien sales to third parties versus does tax sale with a redemption process, and how many states permit repayment plans.
Mm-hmm. I wish I can say that we've done it and I could just tell you all the results right away. We have certainly started doing some research on that through the years. As you can probably imagine, it is a lot more complicated than just looking up each state's tax foreclosure laws. We do have incredible partners like Lincoln Land Institute who have done some pretty incredible analysis of basically kind of the tax rates and collection processes of all 50 states. I am not aware of a very comprehensive survey that has been done recently. I know that there are various, I would say, tax lien advocacy / membership organizations that will tell you how many states are currently selling tax liens. But basically, if you want to find out more, I encourage you to contact us directly and or again, contact your local legal counsel to really get into the nitty gritty of whether your state does sell tax liens.
All right, that was the only question that I saw thus far. So I'm gonna jump right in. Next slide. All right. So again, I'm Nika Nam, the creator of Fight Blight Be More and the co-creator of the Stop Oppressive Seizures Fund. Next slide. I live in Old West Baltimore, and I come into this work in response to the fact that my neighborhood has a concentration of blight, and it isn't the only one in Baltimore with that same issue. And so I want to kind of address several misconceptions today about tax sale as a driver of blight, tax sale as an economic necessity to municipalities, who is made vulnerable by tax sale, and what is necessary to really create an equitable system. You know, in Baltimore, there's a state of emergency that has been created surrounding housing and community development, in part by tax sale. Next slide. Tax sale is a definite driver of vacancy. And in our research, we understand that vacancy is a form of economic violence, and it actually begets, as they would say in the Bible, the interpersonal and intrapersonal violence. Many of the neighborhoods that have high levels of tax lien sales in Baltimore are the same ones that have high levels of physical violence. And there was recently a study of neighborhoods in Richmond, Virginia, that looks at violence and looked at tax lien certificates. And what it found is it actually, tax lien delinquency from external sources, those outside investors, actually was a greater predictor of violence in community than the individual actions of residents. And so we really have to take a look at how tax sale drives violence. Next slide. And how we get here is following the money. We know that Baltimore has a roughly $3 billion budget. 65% of that comes from the general fund. Next slide. Of the revenue sources within the general fund, property taxes make up about 53%. So roughly $1 billion, a third of the city's overall budget. The total funding provided by these revenue sources within the general fund is a little bit short of $2 billion. Next slide. When we take a look at the city's annual tax sale, we find it typically generates between $15 to $20 million on one day in May. Of that $20 million, about $5 million of revenue is attributable to liens sold on owner-occupied properties. Next slide. When we compare that $20 million in revenue from tax sale to the nearly $2 billion of revenue in the general fund, we see that tax sale revenues represent roughly a single percent. Next slide. Further, when we look at the revenue generated in tax sale from owner-occupied properties, that percentage falls to a mere 0.3% of general fund revenues. Given these numbers, it is impossible, at least for me, to view the tax sale as an essential revenue generating activity for the city. Next slide. Vacancy is also, a consequence of tax sale for some of the reasons that, Kim mentioned. But in Baltimore, very specifically, because of a misunderstanding of how tax sales work, many owners abandon the units because they're confused, right? Or properties sit vacant because the lien purchaser really only wanted the 12 to 18% interest or the associated fees, and they don't want to actually take title to the property. Or they go to offer these properties after they foreclose the right to redeem at auction, and folks aren't able to buy the properties because the cost of acquiring the lien and renovating the property exceeds the market value. And there's a whole other dialogue we could have about market valuations of properties in Black communities specifically. But we know that is a driver of why we have some of the problems. When we look very specifically, though, at properties in Baltimore that are classified by the city as vacant, so they have a vacant building notice and they have an active tax lien, we see that they cost the city about $40 million every year in direct services. So that's fire, that's police, that's boarding, that's cutting grass, all of those kinds of things. And as well as the lost revenue from the properties not from folks not paying those property taxes. And that doesn't even account for those indirect costs like the impacts to healthcare, asthma care. Baltimore has 3 times the national rate of childhood asthma, and those things have costs. Next slide. When we start to really look at who's disproportionately impacted by tax sale and the vacancy it causes, we start to see a very disturbing pattern. Next slide. It's the same people, families, and communities that have been targeted by racist housing, community, and economic development policies, of which tax sale is just one. Dr. Andrew Carl's research showed how Black neighborhoods are overassessed as a hidden feature of racist policymaking that both creates a heavier tax burden, but also greater vulnerability to tax sale and displacement as a result. Next slide. There's also a bunch of disturbing rhetoric that we hear, particularly in Baltimore, that circulates saying that people would rather just pay the interest and fees associated with tax sale, or there's this dog whistling that certain people just don't want to pay taxes. And as the chart shows, the population chart in front of you shows, these are the same people who have been the backbone of the city's tax base for at least the last 50 years. And that is even though a lot of the tax dollars that have been collected aren't even appropriately applied in the communities where the folks who have been the backbone of the base live. And certainly, when we really look at where these issues are, they're in Black neighborhoods, Black communities in Baltimore. And so in 2021, the Pro Bono Resource Center reported that 85% of their tax sale clients in Baltimore were Black. Next slide. It's ironic, though, that the very people accused of not wanting to pay property taxes are those who have experienced disproportionate property assessments, which results in higher bills. A Center for Municipal Finance analysis of Baltimore tax assessment shows that the least expensive houses are assessed at 164% of their sales value. Many of these homes, as you might suspect, are in Black neighborhoods. So folks are being overassessed, which leads to higher property taxes. And if we talk about all of the other policies that have depressed the economic earnings and generational wealth transfer of Black families, we know that is it causes a multiplying effect. Next slide. Also, many of the properties, many of the communities are in the footprint of large nonprofits who have taken advantage of the vacancy created by tax sale to acquire more properties on which they pay no taxes, right? Yet no one dog whistles about these large institutions avoiding paying their fair share of taxes or contributing their fair share to community. Next slide. I know that people are thinking we're here really to discuss the path, a path for a new system of property tax collection, not to talk about displacement, not to talk about the nonprofit industrial complex or how property taxes are assessed. But all of these issues have, feed into the tax sale. They all feed into this notion of some communities deserving investment and some not. And the core or the root cause of all of these issues is racism. In response to calls for racial justice in Baltimore, the mayor has, put out a clarion call for equity. And one of the things that, one of the policies that have been addressed, or he's been calling folks to address, is an equitable system for collection of property taxes. And there can't be an equitable system without addressing both the predatory practice of tax sale, ending it, and repairing the harm done to communities by it. Next slide. So the work to reform tax sale has really brought about a number of different proposals. And one of them is to create a prepayment and payment of taxes, post-delinquency payment of taxes program, which would actually generate, is estimated to generate $2 million more than the tax sale without those other auxiliary expenses. And so if we get this tax sale reform right, we have an opportunity to decrease the cost of tax sale related vacancy and to generate more revenue for the system, for the city. It also will give us an opportunity through NREM and potentially through a speculator tax and other tools to move nearly $500 million worth of bad debt tax certificates off of the city's books, thereby increasing property values and revenue collection, but also supporting the ability of nonprofit developers like Parity Homes or Black Women Build to really rebuild neighborhoods and bring properties back into good condition. Next slide. So advocates like myself, we're not waiting for the city or the state to get their acts together in terms of policy. We can't afford to do that because there are people, literally our grandparents, our aunts, our uncles, folks that are disabled, renters, everybody's impacted by this. And so we have been working, a small group of us formed the SOS Fund, where we actually raise mostly through small dollar donations from neighbors and community groups, money to help people pay their property taxes while also offering them wraparound services. And that is the Stop Oppressive Seizures Fund. And over the last 3 years, we have supported about 150 homeowners. We've supported about 140 homeowners. We have about $150,000 raised. We've distributed about $100,000 of that. And we also leveraged our voices with other advocates to kind of push the mayor to pull owner-occupied units out of tax sale for the last 2 years. We're, hoping that the mayor will do that again so that we can continue to, get people through our process, but also there's now federal, state, and local funds available to stabilize housing outcomes because of COVID. So we're hoping to get people through that process. We're also mobilizing, and we did so through a grant from the Center for Community Progress, mobilizing with other advocates as well as folks in community to figure out what tools do we actually want. How can we leverage those tools? How can we make sure that we are putting policy in place that do not repeat the mistakes of the past? And we have, we did a whole process last year. Next slide. And what came, I'm sorry, next slide. I skipped a slide. One more. It's so much here. Okay, so we organized against blight, particularly surrounding the vacancy caused by tax sale. And you can see in front of you what we did, the steps that we took in order to find out what community wanted, what kind of tools they wanted to apply, and what problems they were having, and to what problems they wanted to apply those tools. Next slide. Our key findings were we have to repair, the damage was created by policy, it has to be repaired by policy. We really need to support the notion of fair housing. We need to come up with policies that create housing options that support affordability and different options, whether it's granny flats or accessory dwelling units across the city, particularly in neighborhoods that have been heavily impacted by tax sale, and that we really needed a neighborhood level, a neighborhood directed acquisition and disposition process for vacant, abandoned, dilapidated, misutilized, and underutilized properties in community. Next slide. And so all of that is captured in our paper, The Anatomy of Baltimore's Blight. I encourage folks to read it, and I am happy to answer questions at this time.
Thanks, Nika. So we do actually have a few questions that I'd love to pose. And again, I encourage everyone on the call to feel free to submit their comments or questions. Nothing is silly, nothing is stupid. We are all learning this together. And Nika and I talk about this quite a bit. Nobody has it figured out. We are actually both not attorneys. So we are, we are just trying to share our own experiences. So please feel free to share your own experiences. So one question that has come in is basically about what is being done prior to property taxes, delinquent property taxes having to be enforced, right? So, one of the things that that we talk about as an organization at Community Progress is basically preventing properties from going into decline, right? So really thinking through how to have proper outreach support programs. How do you use code enforcement as a way to, support properties before they get deteriorated, but also too many times we see housing and building code enforcement issue fines to people who can't afford to make the repairs. So how can we think about preventative systems like code enforcement, like tax enforcement, and also have mechanisms to provide some financial support? So Nika talked about the SOS fund, but I'm curious, Nika, from your perspective, and especially in Baltimore, there's a lot of things that are happening prior to people sort of getting into the tax sale. Can you talk a little bit about some of that work?
So I think that, for years, advocates, even long before I even came into the work, had recognized how economic conditions really drives folks to end up in tax sale. People want to pay their bills. The reality of it is, most of the time, we're talking about elderly people, people who have worked 30 and 40 years, folks who worked and paid for homes on contract loans. So you already know they have paid much more than they should have paid for the properties. But the economic conditions that they find themselves in because of all of these different policy mechanisms makes it difficult for them to keep up maintenance, which is why oftentimes people have these code enforcement issues. And so we have a number of things that folks are doing in community, whether it is working with the Department of Housing and Community Development. They have a lights program where they help people do get funding to do home repairs. There's also Civic Works. There's housing upgrades benefiting seniors. So there are programs that have funding, that have technical assistance to help people get these things done. Oftentimes, the outreach is lacking. Like, people don't even know these programs exist. And then there's also this issue of many of the folks that we're talking about are people who spent their life trying to prove that they were not inferior, that they were not trifling, that they were not lazy. And so the notion that they are now, as elders, not able to pay their property taxes or keep their houses up is embarrassing to them. So oftentimes they don't seek out help. So there's a social work piece that I find is missing, that some of us are really trying to mobilize to close the gap, to really get people to understand. This is why I spend so much time, even in the paper, I spent about 15 pages explaining the policy issues that got people here, so people can understand that it's not a failure of people in community that communities have all of this blight or have all of these economic issues. It's actually by the design of policy. And so those are the things that we're really working on. And I think a lot of the community-based organizations are working on is really understanding the policy pieces, doing the outreach and connecting people to those government resources, because it's the people's money, right? That oftentimes are funding this, connecting people to those government resources so they can keep their houses in good condition or pay their taxes, so that they may age in space and then pass those properties on to the next generation. Because as John Kern, one of our program director, would say, one of the best ways to have affordable housing is to receive a legacy home, right? Because it doesn't have a mortgage, right? It doesn't have those additional expenses in terms of interest that you will find if you're going out and purchasing a home in the market.
Yep. No, that's a great point. And one of the questions, and again, our focus a lot of times is on, the vacant abandoned properties, but because we're on this issue and because you mentioned legacy homes, one of the questions is basically, I think this individual is referring to sort of heir properties and the challenges of, property owners or family members whose name may not be on the title of the property and therefore cannot access any of these financial assistance programs. So I think that Baltimore has done a really good job in terms of, again, addressing all of these aspects. But can you talk a little bit about kind of how you have worked with families who can't prove that they own the property or that it is actually a legacy property?
So we have been working very heavily with Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service. They have a program called My Home, My Deed, My Legacy, where they really do deed disentanglement. And we currently have a project where we're looking at properties where the deed has not changed names in more than 25 years, and there is a tax lien certificate, so that we can identify, go to those homes and find out, is the named owner, the deeded owner, dead? And if they are deceased, helping folks through the probate process, because many people don't understand that when your parent or your spouse, if your name isn't on the property, dies, that property doesn't immediately become legally yours, even though technically it is. And so we've done a lot of work socializing this notion of family continuity planning, because for many people in many of these neighborhoods, when you say estate planning, the accessibility goes out the window, because they think estate, they think of rich people. They think that's rich people stuff. They don't understand that estate planning is for is a legal mechanism for everybody. But people also don't have access to, quality attorneys. They don't have access to money to pay for quality attorneys. So working with organizations like MBLS, working with PBRC, working with Maryland Legal Aid, Senior Legal Services, making sure that people are being pointed to those legal resources to help. And again, doing the work, we have on our team, we have a mediator that we can bring in when there's a family issue, to try to figure out who should have the property, help families work through that. So we really have to be about the business. Again, it's a lot of education. It's a lot of sharing about what is an asset, how that house is an asset, and how to process and protect that asset so that generations to come can use that home, for housing, but also for a safe space, for securing family bonds, because it's not just about money. This is about the intellectual property of the things inside the house. If your grandmama's cookbook probably got $1 million pie recipe in it. It's about the art that your uncle did when he went to Micah that's on the walls. It's about all the things that a family home represents. And we are doing about the business of making sure that folks understand that and have access to the resources to protect it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Nika. One of the things you just mentioned that, again, I think is reiterated in some of the comments is that, and where I think actually Baltimore really does excel is that there are so many different sort of industries or sectors that are involved with this effort, right? You do have the lawyers, the government lawyers, the legal services lawyers, but you also have the non-lawyers. And I don't know about you, but I have found that like some kind of special magic happens, right? When you have both lawyers who really understand the policy, who are problem solvers, right? Not just saying no. And you also have folks in the community on the ground who can sort of interpret, right, some of these laws, but also kind of find that mechanism of how do you change policies and laws to actually make them work. Like we could change all the policies in the world, but if they're not going to be implemented and actually have the effect that they're intended to, then it's a waste of time. So I think that everyone, has some access to legal services in your community. They may not be as many as Baltimore City has, but I really encourage you all, to really reach out and figure out, are there services, are there programs that are just maybe not talked about in your community to really prevent, especially the vulnerable homeowners, from becoming delinquent in the first place?
Right.
So, Nika, one of the questions or comments was sort of the role of community land trusts. And before we go there, I think it would be remiss if we didn't talk about kind of one of the systems or tools that Baltimore is working on, that we see a lot of communities work on, that goes hand in hand with tax reform, is land banking, right? So the question that comes up in so many communities and some of the comments reflected today is, okay, well, so we're not going to sell the tax debt, we're going to sell the property, but guess what? Local government does want to have and hold a lot of properties, and most local governments will agree that they're not very good property managers, right? That's not what they do. So, Baltimore is working on creating a land bank as a tool to be able to take some of these properties that, using the judicial and rem tax foreclosure process, creating a more public, transparent mechanism by which these properties are then sold, and actually community who have been disinvested have, right, the option to access these properties and to right the wrong. So do you want to talk a little bit about kind of how your work has both combined the sort of tax enforcement with this thing that we call a land bank?
Sure. So one of the things that we've been very clear about is folks living in community who have experienced 40, 50, 60, 70 years of blight and disinvestment and racist housing policy. Those are the people who get to dictate what repair looks like, what equity actually is, how they want to experience it. And one of the things that we have heard time and time again is that neighborhood associations, residents, community groups, churches worked for years with the housing department to address blight, to address a blighted property and take it through the receivership process. And then at the end of the day, the property goes to auction through the city's receiver, and the new owner does nothing, blights it, leaves it in a blighted condition, or does a halfway, renovation and, charges a lot of money for rent. And so it's been very clear that folks want a mechanism that, an agency or something, right? An entity in order to do neighborhood level, community-based acquisition and disposition. I don't use the term land bank all the time, because land banking, we have people doing private land banking against the interests of the people. And so oftentimes when people hear land bank in community, they just stop, they just stop listening, even though what they're asking for is an entity by which to do the redevelopment that they want done in community. And so we are working to establish what it would effectively be a land bank with an equitable lens. Like, the whole point is, if the community cannot control the outcomes, then it's not something we want to do. We also want to focus very heavily on the neighborhoods that have had their market destroyed by racist housing policy. So we're not worried about middle markets. We're not really worried. We're not worried about, those strong market neighborhoods. We're particularly focused on the neighborhoods that have been destroyed, let's say like Harlem Park and Poppleton by the highway to nowhere, and then later on by tax sale, and then later on by, eminent domain. These are the areas that we really want to focus on. And so we are going through the process of coming up with a land bank legislation for the city, because we already have the state pieces. The state enabling legislation is already there. And really working to get the framework such that we're making sure that this does not become the darling of the developers who, to a degree, have really been a part, the large-scale developers have been part and parcel to the destruction of neighborhoods in Baltimore. To the question about land trusts, just like land banks, just like payment plans, all of these things are tools that we need to have in our toolbox. It was not a single policy that caused the problem in Baltimore. It was a series and set of policies. And so we need a series and set of tools specifically and explicitly designed to address those policies in a way that is both harm reductive and reparative.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Nika. And I would just also add to that I think Baltimore is a good case study, that first of all, these things don't happen quickly, right? We've talked about these things for several years. And I think that, as Nika said about, it's just, there's different tools that all have to be used together. I think that I have yet to find any community that has successfully tackled the sort of tax foreclosure without also talking about what is that public transparent entity of what to do with those properties, right? That's more community oriented. Likewise, I haven't seen a lot of communities create a land bank that haven't addressed, inequitable and broken tax foreclosure systems, since that is a primary mechanism of inventory for a land bank. So I think that sometimes that's the reason why these problems persist, or why local government continues to say they persist, because it's complicated. Right. It is overlapping. It touches every single sensitive touch point in a community. And I think the only way to deal with it is by all working together. And then again, using all the tools at everyone's disposal.
Yeah, and it's very, and to be honest, it's very political, right? Baltimore has a limited budget. And there are folks who feel like, this is us attempting to set up a land bank is an attack on DCHD. And to be clear, it's not. DCHD's current leadership and the current framework that leadership is working from is something that we absolutely support, right? Mm-hmm. We want to modernize permitting office. We want to move from code enforcement to something I heard at Center for Community Progress at the Chicago conference. We want to move from code enforcement to code encouragement. And that means you have to have a particular framework. You have to have a particular process. So we absolutely want that. We want DCHD systems to be modernized. We want them to focus on housing stabilization. But we also recognize that is a municipal agency, and it is subject to, political whims. It is subject to bureaucracy. And frankly, I'm not about the business of waiting. We can't afford to wait. Like, housing is central to people's health. It is literally killing people. And we have to be honest, DCHD's role from its instantiation to its creation, or its predecessor, the Baltimore Regional Housing Agency, to today, has been a purveyor of racist housing and community development policy. And so, as much as, current leadership notwithstanding, we want to give them a chance to show us DCHD in a different form. We're not about to wait. And the problem is as Bill, said, a $7 billion problem. It's more than enough work to go around. We all need to be working together, though, with a singular focus, and that is equitable housing and community development that is repairing the damage done by policy in Baltimore.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know we have just a few minutes left, and I know that my colleagues at Community Progress are probably going to want to say a few departing words, but I know there's a few questions that really want to learn more about the SOS Fund and your work. So I want to reiterate one, that there are various websites, and you will all get a copy of the presentation. And I really encourage you to take a look at the reports that Nika mentioned. I also encourage you, if you're so inclined, folks like the SOS Fund and Fight Blight Baltimore and all sorts of nonprofits out there need resources and help. So please feel free to not just learn, but give if you can. And I just want to thank you, Nika, for just continuing to persevere. There is really, I think, a lot of great leadership in Baltimore. I think there are great people at the city council, housing, community development, legal services, community, all of that. And I think it is folks like you that continue to push, continue to really understand how to make that connection between what's happening in City Hall and what's happening on the ground in the neighborhood. So I just really want to thank you for sharing your insights and continuing to be such an inspiration and, an example for others across the country.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening, because it is more than a notion. And the key thing is I'm really trying to focus on getting folks to understand it's not City Hall that tells the people what to do. It's the people who tell City Hall what to do, and all of the agencies. And when we can begin to move from that framework, when all communities, because that's been happening in some places. When people said they didn't want to live next to Black people, Ordinance 610 was born, right? So we just want all the communities have the same access to their tax dollars, their government, that everyone else does. And then some of these things will resolve themselves. But until that time, we're going to keep pushing.
Good. Thanks, Nika. And again, for folks who want to learn more about Community Progress, please go to the website. I might be stepping on Christina's toes, but also please feel free to reach out, to us if you have questions, if you want support or assess technical assistance, or try to see if there's anything that we could help you provide in your own community. So Christina, with that.
Thanks so much, Kim. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Nika, for sharing your time, your expertise, really amazing work. A reminder that we will share a copy of the slide deck as well as a video recording of today's presentation. And thank you all for joining us for our first Cornerstone webinar of 2023. Be sure to join our listserv to stay tuned for announcements for upcoming webinars. And yeah, with that, we hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.